Good morning, everyone. Welcome. And it's our pleasure to have a learning program today. Drisha, in conjunction with Lincoln Square Synagogue. I just want to say a couple of words before I briefly introduce our first teacher, Professor Rynhold. The topic of religion, in the case of Jewish religion, and I would say Halakhah, and ethics is a very central topic and issue always. And I think it's particularly appropriate that this takes place on Hanukkah, because Hanukkah, on one hand, is the celebration of the sovereignty of the Jewish people, the Hashmonaim, who defeated the Greek Syrians and also the assimilationist Jews who supported them. So from one perspective, it's about sovereignty, one might say kingship in the Bible. And from the other perspective, it's about the temple. The mitzvah of Hanukkah, of course, central mitzvah, there are two. One is the recitation of the Hallel, and the other is the lighting of the candles, which are recalling the menorah of the temple, the purifying of the temple. So on Hanukkah, we have two things that come together. We have the sovereignty, one might say kingship, sovereignty, power. And on the other hand, we have the sacred. And in our Tanakh, one of the two roles of the king, maybe the primary role of the king, is to do justice. Shvatanu Malkeinu. King David is described in chapter 8 of Shmuel as Oseh Mishpat U'Tzedakah L'chol Amo. Mishpat U'Tzedakah. So how does Mishpat and Tzedakah relate to the sacred? And the truth of the matter is, this question, we encountered the question prior to Hanukkah. We encountered the question in Sefer Breshit, because Abraham, on one hand, is reported by God as doing Tzedakah or Mishpat, and teaching his descendants to do tzedakah or mishpat. And he says to God, when he argues with God, "Hashofet karetz lo yaseh mishpat," aren't you the ethical God? You do the right thing. And a few chapters later, we have the story of the binding of Isaac, the Akedah, and the discovery of the sacred space. And the Akedah raises all kinds of questions about ethics, about human behavior, in conjunction with God's imperative. So this is a question that's been around for a long time. And in every generation, questions are raised about Jewish tradition and practice. Is it in consonance with the ethical? Is it the right thing or not the right thing? So we thought that today on Hanukkah would be important to bring in some teachers who will address different facets of this issue. So Professor Rynhold and Sarah Zager and Rabbi Zucchia, Shlomo Zucchia will be our teachers today. So looking forward to a day in which hopefully gets us to think a lot more about this very central question. Thank you all for attending. Thank you to Lincoln Square Synagogue for being our co-host. Did want to say one word about Drisha and the programs that we run over the course of the year. We used to be in a space just a few blocks from here, a very beautiful space actually. And we left that space. We left the space because we wanted to redeploy our assets and to do more teaching and bring more Torah. We continue to do that in New York City. In the summer, we rent buildings at New York University. We run our high school program for girls, and we run our collegiate and graduate program there. During the year, we have partnered with synagogues. And we also have started programs in Israel, Yeshiva for Women in Israel, other programs as well. And we have also online learning now. We're building that as well. So we're doing the programming. Unfortunately, we made the right decision to leave the space. But in any event, so I invite all of you to follow us. Information is, of course, on the internet, and to participate in as many programs as you feel will be useful to you, helpful in getting us all to think more about important issues and to study our classic texts. So thank you very much. I did want to introduce Professor Rynhold very briefly. Professor Rynhold is a professor at Yeshiva University. He teaches both general philosophy and Jewish philosophy. We had the pleasure last year of having Professor Rynhold do some teaching for Drisha. on the philosophy of Rabbi Soloveitchik. Most of his work is, a good deal of his work is in Jewish philosophy, Jewish medieval philosophy. So, Dr. Rynhold, thank you for coming this morning and teaching for us. Here's Dr. Rynhold. Thank you.
Good morning and happy Hanukkah. It's interesting, actually, the ethical dilemma immediately as I walked in with the hot drinks, because they've got kind of proper tea there, right? Black tea and coffee. And when faced with that choice, you should always choose coffee, because as the much, underquoted Jewish philosopher Marx once said, property is theft. So moving on, come on, keep up. All right. So take some time. All right. What we are going to deal with today, I should just say I'll set this up because we have till 12. And so, it's a long session. And, after about 10-15 minutes, the accent loses its sheen. So to keep you here just listening to me for 2 hours is, going to be quite difficult. So what we're going to do is I'm going to set up a problem, a challenge, and then I'm going to leave you to discuss with your colleagues around your tables and go through some of the texts, whether kind of, in groups or however you wish to split your tables, to look at, a response or certain responses to this question, probably for about half hour or so. And then we'll come back together for the final, hour approximately, where I'll give you a view on some of these matters and a response or responses to our challenge. Okay, so that's how we're going to set it up. I'm going to set up a challenge. You will then look at various texts that are relevant to the challenge, and then we'll come back together and hopefully do something of interest in responding to it, okay? And to set up the challenge, what I want to set up here is a challenge to the very idea that as a Jew, you ought to be ethical. Right? The title here is it wrong to be ethical? Right? Which is very strange. How can it possibly be wrong to be ethical? So I want to explain that question, right? Set out that challenge to you and tell you why on earth anybody could possibly think it would be wrong to be ethical, okay? And to do so, we're going to look at the work of Immanuel Kant, okay? So very briefly, the work of the great modern philosopher Immanuel Kant, and his particular challenge that raises this question, all right? And just to begin with, obviously, there are always going to be challenges and conflicts between a religious worldview and some other worldview, right? I mean, that other worldview could be another religious worldview even, right? But certainly a kind of a secular ethic and a religious ethic, there might well be conflicts between them, right? That's not our question. That's not our problem, okay? I guess in medieval times, that kind of might have been the question, right? If you have a truth in Judaism and the world around you is telling you that that's actually not the case and the truth is something else, what do you do, okay? And that's, that's a classic, in some sense, that's the very beginnings of Jewish philosophy. Right? Jewish philosophy begins from the recognition suddenly that there is another worldview out there that is rational, that seems to make sense to us, that the Torah seems to contradict it in some way, or Judaism seems to contradict it in some way. And if only one thing can be the truth, what do you do? Okay? But that's very much kind of a localized problem or localized problems, right? I say A, they say B, which is right? Okay? The modern challenge is very different. The modern Kantian challenge is very different from that because it potentially rules out in principle the very possibility of religious ethics, okay? And to set this up, I want to try and explain that by dipping in a little bit to a couple of quotes from Kant, okay? So Immanuel Kant, Groundwork of Metaphysics of Morals. Hopefully everybody's got a handout. There's a bunch of them. It's not as much as it looks because many of them are in Hebrew and in English translations. So kind of you've got maybe only half the amount of actual texts. Let's begin then, all right? Kant trying to analyze, right, the nature of morality and trying to talk about the nature of good action. What's a good act, all right? Moral philosophy is, you know, in the business of studying, you know, which acts are good, which acts are bad, and mainly what makes them so, right? And in Kant, when he's thinking about what makes an act a good act or a bad act, he says the following, all right? So the first quote that you've got here on the handout, where he says, an action done from duty has its moral worth not in the purpose to be attained by it, but in the maxim according with which it is decided upon. All right, so obviously, you know, an act might be correct because it leads to a good outcome, right? Because of kind of the thing that actually occurs as a result, or it might be good in accordance with, and he uses here the term, the maxim, okay? But if you just think about, you know, your intention, right? Your motivation, all right? Why are you doing the action? What's behind it for you? What's driving you to do this? It depends, therefore, not on the realization of the object of the action, but solely on the principle of volition means will, in accordance with which, irrespective of all objects of the faculty of desire, the action has been performed, right? Meaning what? And he gives here a famous example. Imagine that you wish to give a donation to charity, right? And, you know, you really want to do that, and thank God you have the wherewithal to do so because you are wealthy, right? And then imagine that you have an identical motivation, right? I want to give charity, right? And yet you're very poor, maybe even homeless, so you can't, right? Now, Kant's point here is, why should, as he puts it, the niggardly provision of nature, right? The fact that this poor person has been, you know, so placed that they're unable to fulfill the act they wish to do, why should that be any part of our judgment of her worth as a person, right? Of her goodness or otherwise, just because she's not in the position circumstantially to make good on what it was she wanted to do, okay? So, point being, what is it that kind of you can say unqualifiedly is good, a good will, right? What's kind of internal, the motivation? And it's the motivation really that for Kant, therefore, is the locus of value, right? A good act is a good act because I want to do this thing. Sometimes I can't. But as he says there, right, the principle of volition, the desire to do that, right? The fact that I want to do that, irrespective of, right, all objects of faculty of desire, and whether the action has been performed, right, that's what makes you a good person, or not, as the case may be. Okay, very straightforward, right, a very kind of simple idea, and actually kind of intuitively, right, has some appeal, right? The idea that whether I'm a good person or not, whether I have kind of performed a good act or not, might have more to do with the intent and motivation than the result of the action. It's not to say the result of the action can be, you know, bad, right? We can say kind of whatever happened was a bad thing. Whether the person doing it did a bad thing is a separate question, right? So the intent, the motivation, very important. That's his starting point, okay? The question then arises as to, okay, kind of well and good, what is the correct motivation, right? So we're now focused on motivation, right? Or we're focused at very least on the principle, right, that you are using in order to act, right? On what principle are you basing your act? And of course, lots of different possibilities there, right? So which one is the good one, right? What kind of principle of volition, as he puts it, would define you as a good person, right? Obviously, you can have good or bad maxims, as he puts it, right? So he goes on, have a look at number 2, where Kant writes, it certainly accords with duty that a grocer should not overcharge his inexperienced customer. And where there is much competition, a sensible shopkeeper refrains from so doing and keeps to a fixed and general price for everybody, so that a child can buy from him just as well as anyone else. Thus people are served honestly. But this is not nearly enough to justify us in believing the shopkeeper has acted in this way from duty or from principles of fair dealing. His interest required him to do so. Right, so what's his example here? The honest shopkeeper, right? Now, question is, why is the shopkeeper being honest, right? And on the one hand, as he says, right, well, there's a lot of competition, right? So I'm going to be honest, because if I get a bad reputation for not being honest, then people won't come to me, and everybody should be able to come to me, whether they know me or they don't know me, right? And they know I'm honest. And the problem for Kant is that's not being moral, okay? That's not acting out of a sense of duty. That's acting out of a sense of self-interest, right? The reason I'm being honest is so I get more business, right? That's not moral, right? For Kant. For Kant, that maxim, right, the principle upon which I act must be for the sake of, as he puts it here, duty, right? The word is duty, right? And duty is not about self-interest. Therefore, if the reason he's acting is I'll get more business because it's, you know, I should be honest so that people don't think of me as unfair, then he's not actually doing a moral act, okay? So when Kant tries to define in some way what it is, what is this principle that determines your duty, one of the things he's kind of most famous for, and again, to put it very simply and kind of broadly, is you're not acting for any ulterior motive, right? You are doing something for the sake of duty and for the sake of duty alone, right? To act morally is to act for the sake of duty, not because you want to, you know, do well, not because you want people to like you, and of course, therefore, not because God told you to, right? If God told you to, if I'm doing something because God told me to, I'm not being moral, right? To be moral is to do it out of a sense of duty, not because God told me to, right? And therein lies the problem, right? The problem is that Kant is, in effect, making it in principle, impossible for there to be such a thing as a moral mitzvah. If it's a mitzvah, fine. It's a command of God and I do it. But if I'm acting morally, then that can't be in any way part of the picture. I have to do it because it's my duty, right? Not because God told me to, because I'm acting for an ulterior motive, okay? Right? This is the kind of the Kantian challenge. And it's not to do, you know, this is purely for him, by the way, when he goes on, and we will just briefly have a look at number 3, right? Because so far I've been talking very, you know, loosely about acting for the sake of duty, right? And in acting for the sake of duty, so far, all we've really said is what it's not, right? It's not acting for this reason, for that reason, that is for duty. But what is, how do I work out what my duties are then, right? What is this maxim, this moral maxim, this duty? How do we find it? And he has various different ways of couching it. This is the most famous, right? So have a look at number 3. As he says, since I have robbed the will of every inducement that might arise for it as a consequence of obeying any particular law, right? As we just said, he's ruled out any reason for doing it that kind of, you know, achieves any kind of purpose, right? There's no inducement. So how are we to understand how to define or work out our duty? He goes on. Nothing is left but the conformity of actions to universal law as such, and this alone must serve the will as its principle. That is to say, I ought never to act except in such a way that I can also will that my maxim should become a universal law. Okay? The test of what is moral, right? The test of what acts are moral is the maxim upon which you have acted something that you could will could become universal law. And what's important here, and kind of the genius of Kant, here, whether he's right or wrong, right? But the genius is he's trying here to give us a moral, I hesitate to say system, right? But he's trying to give us, right, a rational account of morality that doesn't depend in any way on content, right? Content's always going to be controversial, right? I think that, you know, there should be, what example could there be? A right to abortion, kind of in any cases, because a woman's rights over her own body, etc., versus I believe that shouldn't because you're murdering, right? Okay, well, those are two different contents, right? And people are going to argue for those contents from completely different premises. And the idea that you might be able to find some neutral point on which they both agree and one group says, ah, you're right, sorry, I was wrong, right? Difficult, right? You have these intractable problems. So, you know, where do we get our moral ideals and principles from? So Kant says, yeah, don't worry about content. This is completely formal, totally formal, right? There is a formal test here. And the formal test is the thing that you are deciding to do, could you will it to be universal? With universality here being the test, I guess, of rationality, right? Something's rational if every thinking human being, if they were thinking correctly, would agree to it, right? So his example that he gives to flesh this out a little bit, does a lying promise accord with duty? Right, so I make a promise and I don't mean to keep it, okay? How could you, on purely formal basis, not saying because lying is wrong, right? Because as we said, we don't want content here, we want to generate from the ground up, from completely and utterly neutral, rational foundations. Right, how can you rule that out? And he says the following: I have then to ask myself, should I really be content that my maxim, the maxim of getting out of a difficulty by a false promise, should hold as a universal law, one valid for both myself and others? Right, so the test, remember, the test is, can I will it as universal law? So I'm going to make a false promise, can I will that as universal law? And he says, I then become aware at once that I can indeed will to lie, but I can by no means will a universal law of lying. For by such a law, there could properly be no promises at all, since it would be futile to profess a will for future action to others who would not believe my profession, or who, if they did so over hastily, would pay me back in like coin. Consequently, my maxim, as soon as it was made a universal law, would be bound to annul itself. Now, you know, I'm not going to get into Kantian scholarship here, right? There are many different versions of exactly what he means by this, right? I'll give you one. You know, whether it's the correct one is up for grabs, but the point here would be, I promise to do X and then I'm not going to keep it, right? Can I will that universally, right? So it is a universal law that everybody can break their promises whenever it suits them, right? Says he, if that were to be, you couldn't even make the promise in the first place, because the whole institution of promising would never have got off the ground, right? If promises were things that were ultimately meaningless, because you can break them whenever it suits you, then the whole institution of promising would never have started. Thus, to say, I want to make a false promise, universalize it, you couldn't even make the statement. It would be a contradictory statement even. Right? I promise that, well, what's a promise? Right? Promise has just collapsed. The whole idea of promising has collapsed. Therefore, you could not will it as a universal, right? Maxim. Okay? And this isn't kind of practically about whether people would do it, whether people would not do it, kind of the promising thing. This is just about whether we can envisage a world. Does a world in which there is an institution of promising that everybody breaks whenever it's convenient to them, Does that world make sense? Could there be such a world? And Kant is arguing not, right? Therefore, he believes that you can generate duty out of purely formal considerations, right? Can I universalize it or can I not universalize it? If I can't, then it's not moral, okay? Now, that, again, whether he's precisely correct in exactly the way he formulates this or not, right? The challenge is, can there be such a thing, right? If we, like Kant, agree that motivation, the internal principle upon which you act, defines morality, right? And in the modern age, that's certainly a very, very influential idea, right? I don't know how you do it here, right? But, you know, in the UK, right, where you have the government whips who are meant to, you know, make sure that the Conservatives vote Conservative and Labour vote Labour, right? There are certain votes where that doesn't happen because it's a moral question. And a moral question is a matter of personal conscience, right? It has to be that I'm voting because, you know, it's my personal moral motivation, right? Kind of also kind of a Mendelssohnian faith thing as well, I guess, in a sense, right? Faith is meaningless if it's kind of gun to your head, right? Faith is only meaningful as a voluntary commitment, right? I'm only really religious if I actually do this because I believe it. If I'm doing it because, you know, somebody's forced me to, I'm doing it for all kinds of other reasons. Yeah, it's not really faith. Yeah. So that's the challenge. Is it possible to be a religious person who acts ethically? And I don't mean by that, is it possible for a religious person to do acts that are generally categorized as moral, right? Of course it is, right? We do it all the time, right? Hopefully, right? The question is, when I'm doing that act, am I actually being moral? Should I be moral even? Should I be, right? Or should I actually not be moral? Is it wrong to be an ethical person? Because what I should be doing is serving God, not being ethical, right? That's the challenge, all right? And what you have now before you are a bunch of texts, quite a lot of them. So I'm going to give you about half an hour, all right? And I'll just let me mention, there are two kind of, you know, rabbinic texts, so to speak, all right, very briefly. The reason for that is, as Rabbi Silver mentioned, I'm a professor of philosophy, right? So kind of philosophy is what I do, and more importantly, what I know, right? Or at least I know a bit. I wouldn't make that claim about kind of, say, you know, the world of rabbinics, all right? I mean, obviously, yeah, I know it in as much as we all know it and as much as we studied it and went to yeshiva, blah, 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 but, you know, I wouldn't claim to be a scholarly expert. Therefore, I've thrown a couple of interesting texts in there, but the bulk of what we're doing is what philosophers, Jewish philosophers, have said about this. The other reason for that is, as soon as you start doing certainly any medieval Jewish philosophy, you realize that you can pretty much make the text say anything. So you might as well just go straight to the philosophers themselves. And so you've got two of those, right? I then have a bunch of selections from the famous, maybe infamous, modern Israeli thinker, Yeshayahu Leibovitz. Two selections from him in the original Hebrew and in the English. And then, under number 3, the Rambam, some texts from the Mishnah Torah. And I would be shocked if you get any further than that. You might not even get there, right? But if you just look at and discuss the two rabbinic texts and Leibovitz, right, that will more than suffice. Obviously, if you kind of, oh yeah, Leibovitz did that yesterday, so you can go straight through, then by all means, just keep going, right? But I think that let's give it till conveniently, more or less, let's kind of reconvene at 11, right? See what you can get through, discussing the text, and obviously, as they bear on our question, all right? Okay, what do these texts have to say in response to the question of whether it is possible, right, to be a religious, ethical person? Or are you going to ultimately have to be one or the other, all right? Okay, all right, I'll circulate round, and I'm happy to talk through, but take it away. All right, shall we begin? So we have our question. Is it wrong to be ethical? And I guess to begin with, let's just start. Let me ask you what you make of the first text from the Sifra. What does it contribute to this question? Do you think it pushes us in one direction or the other? Anybody want to comment? Anybody want to say what they took from that first one that was relates to the question in some way? Any volunteer to speak up for their group, table, self? Yeah, we have somebody over there. Okay, shall I, you know what, I'll bring you the mic and then everybody can hear you.
Well, I was just surprised that they talk about your motivations at all. That they actually care. It's not just what you do.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't the same motivations what Khan was talking about, but I was surprised that they weren't just saying it's what you do, as opposed to it depends why you're doing it.
Okay, so the first one certainly does seem to care about motivation, and it's definitely, we're not going to find in any of the sources that I've given you a precise account of the motivation that's going to in any way gel with Kant. And in a sense, really, the third text, the third Kantian text, was just there for exposition. It doesn't actually, it's not really germane to our question, because our question is to do with, you know, what's your motivation, right? Is your motivation an ethical motivation? And then we'll define ethical, how we'll define it. Or is it, I'm doing it because it's a mitzvah? Now, how exactly you define the ethical obligation, right, might not be precisely the way that Kant does. But the very, I guess, clash that he sets up kind of just in principle, systematically, between either it's ethical because it is done out of a sense of ethical duty, right, or it's religious. That's kind of the key problem. And as the gentleman just said, clearly the first text does seem to be concerned with motivation. And it's not just about what you do. Anybody else? Any other authors to speak to that first text? Anybody want to add anything to that? So I would say that the first text does seem to naturally lend itself to reinforcing the problem for us, because it does seem to be saying that if you're doing something, and you know, as it says, you know, I don't want to wear shatnez, right? I have no interest in, you know, having a bacon sandwich, is actually not to be the way one ought to frame these things or act. What one should say is, I really want that, but I'm not doing it because God told me not to, right? That's in terms of the evaluation here. He says, whence it, a man should not say, right? You shouldn't say, I'm good with all these mitzvot, they're great, they speak to my internal motivations. They seem to instead be placing on a higher level somebody who doesn't want to act that way and does it just because God says so, which seems to reinforce our problem. Right? Should I be ethical? Well, actually, you should probably want to not be ethical and then be ethical anyway because you were told to. And that way, you're doing a mitzvah, right? Now, one of the texts we have here actually tries to read this rather differently. And if you just fast forward and go to the Maimonides text, Shmoneh Prakim, the top of the page says the 6th chapter. So this is the 6th chapter of his Shmoneh Prakim, which is his introduction to Mishnah Avot in his commentary to the Mishnah. You don't have it in Hebrew because it was written in Arabic. So I just gave you one translation, not both. And here, I suppose the first thing to mention is that Maimonides is clearly not working in any kind of Kantian framework, right? He is far more given to an Aristotelian virtue ethic, but virtue ethics is significant in as much as, similarly, what's going on in here really matters. And that's exactly what he's discussing in this particular part of Shmoneh Prakim, where he talks about the difference between the virtuous man and the continent man. So a continent man will do the right thing, but will pretty much be like our character in the Sifra. Manages to do the right thing despite internally his passions maybe not being in order in terms of virtue. The virtuous man is doing it because he's virtuous and he wants to. But in dealing with that, it's very interesting the way that the Rambam reads this, because he says the following. Let's have a look there. The philosopher said, even though the continent man performs virtuous actions, he does good things while craving and strongly desiring to perform bad actions, right? That's the continent man. The continent man does the right thing, but there's an inner battle going on. He has to overcome his desires and his passions in order to do the right thing. And the philosophers say that surely it is better to do it as a virtuous person and not battling some kind of, Yetzer hara. So, goes on. He struggles against his craving and opposes by his action what his appetitive power, his desire, and the state of his soul arouse him to do. He does good things while being troubled at doing them. The virtuous man, however, follows in his action what his desire and the state of his soul arouse him to do. And he does good things while craving and strongly desiring them. There is agreement among the philosophers. The virtuous man is better, more perfect than the continent man. And that seems to stand to reason. We would want somebody who is, for example, giving tzedakah to do it because they want to do it. Not to do it saying, I hate you, but I'm going to do it because God commands me to. Who's a better person? However, if we skip to the next paragraph, when we investigated the speech of the sages about this matter, we found that according to them, someone who craves and strongly desires transgressions is more virtuous and perfect than someone who does not crave them and suffers no pain in abstaining from them. Right? That's our text, the Sifra. Better if actually you're struggling against your Yetzer hara. So there seems to be, this is an example of the kind of problem I began with in medieval times. There would be a clash maybe between a particular element of Greek thought, a particular element, well, Arabic Greek thought, and a particular element of Jewish thought, and you'd have to try and render them compatible in some way, or show one of them is right and one of them is wrong. This is an example. And Maimonides here is troubled, because philosophically, it's not Kant, but philosophically, it remains the case that the reason for my action, or at least what's going on internally with my passions, should match what's going on externally with my actions, says the philosopher, and yet we have texts that seem to say the opposite, encouraging us effectively to not be ethical, but to do things because God told us to. However, the Rambam has a solution to this. Let us go to the next paragraph. If the external meaning of the two accounts, philosopher and Jewish sages, is understood superficially, the two views contradict one another. However, that is not the case. Rather, both of them are true, and there is no conflict between them at all. For the bad things to which the philosophers referred when they said someone who does not desire them is more virtuous than someone who does desire them and restrains himself, these are the things generally accepted by all the people as bad, such as murder, theft, robbery, fraud, harming an innocent man, repaying a benefactor with evil, degrading parents, things like this. They are the laws about which the sages, peace be upon them, if they were not written down, they would deserve to be written down. Famous distinction between Mishpatim and Chukim in Yoma. If you go down to the following paragraph, when the sages said the continent man is more virtuous and his reward is greater, they had in mind the traditional laws. If you think about the examples, right? Shutness, kashrut. It wasn't saying you're a better person if you really want to murder somebody, but you manage to conquer it. That's not what the Sifra say. Clearly, you're a much worse person. You're a better person if you don't want to murder people and you don't murder people. However, if you really fancy that cheeseburger and don't eat it, well, actually, then that is a mark of a higher religious type, says Maimonides reading the Sifra. So he actually does not see that first text as particularly pertinent to our problem, despite first appearances. It's saying when it comes to moral matters, you actually should be disposed to do those things and not just do them because God commanded you to. It's only in the area of those laws that we call, whether you want to call them chukim or, ritual laws, revealed laws, various different titles through the history of kind of philosophy for them. It's only those where conquering your natural passions is seen as a good thing. So if Maimonides is correct in his reading of that passage, then passage 1 doesn't actually yield our problem in terms of rendering somebody who doesn't want to be ethical a better person. Of course, our problem to begin with was precisely to say that Judaism maybe does suggest that, but then the first source we've looked at that maybe suggests that turns out not to. That's at least on Maimonides' reading. Is that clear? Do we all follow how that first text might suggest a reinforcement of the Kantian problem, but ultimately is solved if you follow the Rambam's reading of it? The one problem, of course, is erva, illicit relations. Is that a ritual law? Is that something we don't naturally have a desire for? So maybe that is a problem for Maimonides' reading of this. Right? But we'll leave that aside to get our teeth into the key conceptual issues. I am going to, for the moment, skip the second Rambam text, the Mishnah Torah text. We will have some time to come back to it. But let's go to Leibowitz. Leibowitz is interesting because, on the one hand, formally, his view of Judaism seems very similar to Kant's view of ethics. However, as a result of this, it is Leibowitz precisely for whom it seems wrong to be ethical. At least religiously wrong to be ethical. That's quite important. I probably should have couched the title that way. It's not wrong to be ethical, might just not be religiously right. Let us then have a look at what Leibowitz has to say. And Leibowitz begins by, in a way that looks quite similar to Kant, right? Not identical, but similar, talking about two types of religiosity. I guess let's just do the English for the sake of time. Two types of religiosity may be discerned, says he. This is at the top of the third page on the handout, or if it's double-sided, beginning of the second. Two types of religiosity may be discerned. One founded in values and beliefs from which follow requirements of action. The other posited on imperatives of action, the observance of which entails values and intention. The religion of values and beliefs is an endowing religion, a means of satisfying man's spiritual needs and assuaging his mental conflicts. Its end is man. God offers his services to man. A person committed to such a religion is a redeemed man. A religion of mitzvot is a demanding religion, imposes obligations, tasks, makes of man an instrument of the realization of an end which transcends man. The satisfactions or offers are those deriving from the performance of one's duty. Good old Kantian word. The religious practitioner serves his God lishma because he's worthy of worship, kind of like the moral person who does what he does out of duty. That's not a typo, I just added that. The two types of religiosity may be found within all religions, but religions differ from one another in the extent to which one type predominates. And effectively, he thinks Christianity is the religion founded in values, Judaism, religion founded on imperatives. Fine. So what's this distinction that he's setting out then? Does anybody want to say what they got from Leibovitz's account? Anybody want to tell us what they thought from looking at it? No? The accent still holds its charm? Here we go.
My friend Michael, it seems, at least well, it seems to both of us, that the first version is the Kantian version. Even though he mentions God, it's really all about, it's all focused on man. God is in the service of man. The second version is what the Rambam is saying. The second one is the Rambam. It's all about what we call religious goals.
Okay. But I guess we're here, so I'll go first there. And
I would suggest that the distinctions that Leibovitz is drawing between Judaism and Christianity, other religion, is that Judaism is focused on the law, which applies to the entirety of society. This is how we hold it's the laws and obedience to the laws, however you may feel about those laws, that hold society together. And with respect to the other religions, they'd rather want you to individually subscribe to the values, the morals, if you will, of the laws without reference to the binding the entire society together in a peaceful and just way. That's my take.
okay, and there was someone, I'm just going to go, I saw his hand and then I'll continue.
It's really a question. I don't understand what he means. It says, the religion of mitzvot transcends we want to, is demanding an infinite realization of an end which transcends man.
Mm-hmm.
What is this end? Since it seems to be so formalistic,
Mm-hmm.
so much about just doing this just because God commanded it.
Yes.
What is this transcendent goal?
Okay. We will deal with that hopefully, and one more.
Okay, so I had difficulty with this thing, besides the fact I have difficulty with the whole Halakhah of Abraham on the line. If anything, I would see it as learning not to sacrifice. That's me, but I would take more of Judaism as Abraham pleading, why would you kill innocent people,
Mm-hmm.
Murderers, and then having the courage to go and say vote.
Right.
And I would take the whole religion, I would say, this thing of Christianity, if they've killed so many other people, I wouldn't put them up there in terms of being a higher level, or, whatever he says, the sacrifice of God for mankind would sort of like contradicts it. So that's my comment on it. Okay.
All right, let's first maybe set out in general what Leibovitz is saying, and I'll come back to what was said about lining it up with Kant or the Rambam's views. There are two forms of religion, right? One is based on value, so we have a certain value. The question of what I do, therefore, is, well, whatever serves those values. So we start with some prior notion of this is the good at which we are aiming. We then have a religion that is tailored to that good. That's religion of, as he puts it, values and beliefs. And he says that's Christianity. Whereas Judaism puts, to use the philosophical terminology, the right before the good. Right? That first view puts the good before the right. This is my definition of what is good. This is my value. What is right action? Whatever leads to it. So you start by defining what's good, and then whatever leads to that, that's right action. Judaism is no. Here are the right actions, period. It starts with the right. It gives us those acts. Whether or not they serve man is immaterial, because man is not the ultimate value, God is. And therefore, Judaism is a demanding religion. God is not meant to serve us. I'm meant to be an Eved Hashem. He's not meant to be an Eved Daniel, right? Or humanity, for that matter. This is Leibovitz's basic starting point. And therefore, religion, Jewish religion, is and ought to be demanding of me performing mitzvot, not me doing things that serve me or human society, because man is not the ultimate value. So the interesting thing is, in terms of, if we come back to the Kantian idea, on the one hand, formally, there is a similarity between Leibowitz and Kant. For Leibowitz, I have to do mitzvot because they are mitzvot. In the same way as for Kant, I have to do my duty because it is my duty. Formal similarity. For Kant, if I'm doing it for some other reason, I'm not being moral. For Leibowitz, if I'm doing it for some other reason, I'm not performing a mitzvah. If the reason that I'm nice to you is because I think it's the right thing to do morally, then I've actually, and this is really the crux of the issue to me, I call it the Bittul Torah objection. Every time I'm moral, it's Bittul Torah. I could have been performing a mitzvah just then. I could have been being nice to you because God told me to, and instead, I was nice for moral reasons. The Bittul Torah objection. Every time I am moral, it's Bittul Torah. And this is very important because Leibowitz does not for one second think Judaism doesn't command things that coincide, thankfully, with morality, right? So the second text that you have from Leibowitz states that. V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. So clearly we're ethical. No, ani Hashem. V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Why should I be ethical? Because God told me to. Because I'm God. Not because it's the right thing to do. And in that sense, it's obviously the complete opposite of Kant. And he states this explicitly. For Kant, man is the ultimate value. For Judaism, God is. And in coming to the question about what does it mean when he speaks of transcending, where was the line? Yes, realization of an end which transcends man. That's what he means. The end is performing mitzvot. Those mitzvot are divine. Those mitzvot are transcendent to human beings, because whether they serve my interests or not actually is not part of the calculation for anybody. I am doing things that transcend human interest. So Leibowitz really doubles down on, we started, this is a challenge. How can you have an ethical mitzvah? Leibowitz's answer is, you can't. You've got to make a choice. Nothing wrong with being ethical. Leibowitz is very, very demanding ethically. Ethics is great. Just don't confuse it with religion. Religion is something else. Religion is those acts that we do because God commanded us to. Ethics are the things we do that serve human society. It's interesting, this is, he was renowned, Leibowitz, for being a very, very vocal critic of the state of Israel. And in his mind, he was providing a very, very stringent moral critique. The reason he could do that was precisely because he attributed absolutely no religious value to the land of Israel. Israel for him was very important. Zionism for him was a complete success. He writes this, you know, my view of Zionism, complete success. Why? The purpose of Zionism was a nation state for the Jews, and we got one. Success, period. And precisely because, therefore, it had no religious significance for him, he could be a moral critic of it. It's meant to be serving human ends, and therefore I'm going to make human critiques. So he was a, you know, interesting figure, to put it mildly, but let's leave that aside. Therefore, when he starts that second text, he says it. Ethics, when regarded as unconditionally asserting its own validity, is an atheistic category par excellence. Ethics is an atheistic category because it demands that we have in view that our value is human society. And if that is our value, that is a wonderful thing, but just don't confuse it with the service of God, which is separate. Now, this obviously, number one, it just says, is it wrong to be ethical? Yes. Not wrong to do ethical things. We do plenty of ethical things we're commanded to. But in terms of that Kantian definition of being ethical, says Leibowitz, I shouldn't be doing that. It seems a lot of the time, as I say, the Bittul Torah objection. I should be doing this in service of God. Also very different from the Rambam's reading that we just saw in Shmoneh Prakim, where he seems to distinguish. Don't have the cheeseburger because of God. Don't murder people because it's the wrong thing to do. Leibowitz seems to think for all these things, if we're being religious, we have to motivated by our service of God. And as I say, that's really challenging and troubling to think that being ethical is actually wasting an opportunity to be religious. Very troubling, very difficult. Also, of course, the Akedah, the example he uses, does mean that whether or not mitzvot serve ethical ends doesn't seem to be terribly relevant. Now, I should say in parentheses that Leibowitz actually, elsewhere in his work, is often very exercised morally by certain contemporary challenges. So I say contemporary, 1980s, he wrote a famous piece on the status of women in Judaism and all of those issues, and had at the time very progressive ideas on it. So this didn't actually rule out for him making certain ethical changes, but that's because in his view, those types of mitzvot were in a slightly different category. So I'm not going to get into that, but I don't want to leave you with the impression that Leibowitz therefore would have been a straight down the line, everything written in Torah Shebichtav, Torah Sheba'al Peh, I have to do exactly as it was written however many hundred years ago. That's actually not the case, though it gets complicated trying to reconcile it with this part of his thought. For more on that, you can see my Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on Leibowitz. Self-promotion, love it. I'm becoming very American. Sorry. Sorry? Oh yeah, next semester. Yes, I am. Thank you. I'm actually not as self-promoting as I could be. I should hire you. Okay, so yes, question.
One could also see that if the worship of God is your highest, that doesn't necessarily exclude that a lot of what God wants is for people and society, even though you might say that's not 100% of it, but it's a good part of it. And the Sheva, some Noahide laws, and God created all man, so that he was sort of equal in certain ways, and derives from that too. So to me, even though it's not 100%, and I don't agree with people.
Yeah.
So you could say that that's not, they're not mutually exclusive, even though it might not be 100% of what that is.
100%, they're not mutually exclusive, and that's why he points out there are ethical mitzvot. However, the idea that this would be in any way the motivation for mitzvot being ethical, those that are, would be a problem, because it would mean God is serving us, serving human society, not vice versa. So it is, thankfully, these things do coincide. And there's a sense in which obviously they would have to. And that's not so much to serve humanity as to serve God, because if we can't survive as human beings, then there won't be any Torah and mitzvah. So we need to have a functioning society, and presumably, therefore, a lot of this will coincide. Whether it's motivated by that, if we can even talk about, divine motivation for doing it. But his point would be that in terms of values, the ultimate value is the service of God, not the service of man. Therefore, religion trumps ethics. And there is an important sense in which we should be serving God rather than being ethical, even when those coincide in terms of action, right?
I would still counter that by saying that the only real way to be ethical is if you say that ethics comes from some outside.
Okay, that is, we will kind of arrive there in a couple of different ways, actually, shortly. So a couple of other questions were there, I saw around up the back there. That's good. I'm not very good at ethics. Well, here he just says Christianity. He doesn't necessarily say all others, but yeah.
So my question is, what do you say about praying to God and asking Him for something, for help, for your
Yeah. So let me answer that in terms of what Leibovitz says about it, because at least he is absolutely consistent in terms of his own system. And he famously said once in passing, though something else that he wrote in a piece in this same collection. So he writes that the occasional prayers, as he calls them, prayers occasioned by an incident. The example he uses prayer for the parachutists in Sahel, right? Says nonsense. Right? If the parachutist has done his training, and if the people following up the parachutists have done their job, please God, it'll be safe. If either of those are not the case, ain't no prayer going to help you, right? So he does believe that those are self-serving prayers that are problematic. Tefillah's tefillah, that's fine. But tefillah in terms of me saying these set things that have been laid down thousands of years ago that may or may not be personally meaningful, yeah, but the fact that I say them and I do them and I relate to God, that's all that matters. And more than that, that's the only genuine motivation for tefillah. He once said, as I say, the thing he said in passing, I've not seen it written, but you know, if God had told us to recite the New York telephone directory, that would be just as meaningful. So that's at least it's considered. Now, obviously, many people would disagree with his views on that, but at least it is consistent with his own system to this point. One of the things that makes him fascinating is at certain points you read him and he sounds like a Haredi, and at other points he is the most liberal of liberal. So he's a fascinating figure in this way. Let's maybe get to another view here. A response number 3, the Rambam's mission to our laws of repentance. So this is very famous, very well-known distinction that the Rambam makes between two forms of service of God, and appears to reverse, in some ways, the Leibovitzian approach. So let's have a look. Laws of Repentance, this is the final chapter where he says, let no man say, behold, I perform the precepts of the Torah and engage myself in its wisdom, so that I will receive all the blessings described therein, or so that I will merit life in the world to come, and I will separate myself from the transgressions against which the Torah gave warning, so that I will escape the curses described therein, or so I will suffer excision from the life of the world to come. It is improper to serve the Lord in such way. For whoever serves the Lord in such way, he's a worshipper because of fear, which is neither the degree of the prophets nor the degree of the sages. And the Lord should not be worshipped that way. Save only by, and then he's, you know, as a product of his time. We'll leave that unsaid. So far, so Leibovitz. You should not serve out of self-interest. Here, the self-interest being specifically to do with fear of punishment. So don't serve out of self-interest. That's fine. That's very Leibovitz as well. But then, what's the flip side? The worshipper, because of love, at the bottom of the sheet, engages himself in the study of the Torah and the observance of precepts and follows the paths of wisdom on no account in the world, neither for fear of evil nor in order to inherit the good, but he does the true thing because it is true. And in the end, the good comes because thereof. That degree is a great degree indeed, and not every scholar attains it, for such was the degree of Abraham our father, etc., etc. Oved me'ahava, to worship out of love. To worship out of love is to do things because they're the right thing to do. That's Kant, right? Why am I doing the right thing? Because it's the right thing. Why am I doing it? Because it's true, right? As he says there, Oved miyira, right? He does the true thing because it is true, period. It's not to do with self-interest. It's not to do with any ulterior motive. It's because it is right. That is very different from the Leibovitz view, in as much as, and this would depend a little bit on how we define truth, of course, but we'll see further why it does genuinely differ from Leibovitz. For Leibovitz, truth doesn't really seem to enter into it. I do what is right, God tells me a list of things and I do them, period. That is how I serve God. For Rambam, there is truth to that. I still do those things, but I do them because they are true. It's not just based on divine will, it seems to be based on divine wisdom, shall we say. There is a rationale there, there's a reason. It is the truth. And therefore, I should do it because it is the truth. But if it is the truth, we're going to end up with a slightly different problem. So on the one hand, Maimonides might be seen as a solution to the original challenge. Right? We could present Maimonides here as giving us a solution. Why do I perform mitzvot? Well, because they're the right thing to do. They are the right thing to do. They are the truth. And therefore, what God is giving us is the truth, and there's no real tension here between serving God and doing what is true, because he says we should do it because it is true. And therefore, he seems to be unaware of or not particularly bothered by this apparent tension. Well, if you do it because it's true, are you doing it because God told you to? And that's a real problem. The eclipse of God. I am now going to command you something that I want you all to do. I want you all to believe that 2 + 2 = 4. I assume you've all done that. I assume the reason you've done that isn't because Daniel Rynhold just commanded you to. A commandment's irrelevant. It's the truth. You believe it because you believe it, not because I told you to. So if mitzvot are true, as the Rambam says, and fine, truth is grounded in God, all well and good. But nonetheless, hasn't he eclipsed the idea of a commanding God? If I'm doing it because it's true, I'm not doing it in any way because of God telling me to, any more than you believe 2 + 2 = 4 because I told you to. This is really the kind of, you know, the center of the issue. For Leibovitz, we do things because God told us to. We therefore have a commanding God, but it yields a challenge. And the challenge is, should I be good to people because I'm a good person because it's right, or should I do it because God told me to? Leibovitz very clearly, because God told you to. That's good religion. Doesn't seem to be good ethics. Rambam, on the other hand, seems very happy to say, do it because it is the truth. And that sounds great. I'm now doing the right thing because it's the right thing and I'm being ethical and that's wonderful. However, the problem then becomes, what becomes of the idea of a commanding God? God seems to disappear from the picture. He is eclipsed because I don't really need to be doing these things in any way because of any kind of commandment. I do it because it's right, the same way you believe 2 + 2 = 4. And there's a sense in which that's back to where we began. That was the Kantian challenge, right? If you do it because of God, it's one reason. Doing this is moral, that's the other. And being moral is to do it because it's moral, not because of God. Rambam tries to push them together. It's true, and God is the source of truth. However, it does still seem to kind of make God almost an irrelevance, right? Pushes him out of the picture because I'm not responding to God when I'm being moral. I'm just doing it because I'm being moral. And that seems problematic. So, how are we to ultimately try and solve this problem? Yeah, sure. Well, that was kind of the starting point that Kant himself brought that into, and like I say, not the first. You've got it way back in ancient Greece as well. And I think there is clearly a debate within the world of normative ethics regarding what makes acts right or wrong, or what makes agents good or bad agents. And we, for the purposes of today, are following that view. And as I say, it's not a silly view in any way. It seems to actually make some sense that it does matter what's going on inside when you act. Might matter so much that it can defy, right? Cover up, okay? That's more or less the idea that we're dealing with in some way, loosely, obviously. The idea that that matters religiously is not alien to us. So let's just see if we can square this circle in any way. I'm going to point you to another part of Shmoneh Prakim, the one before, on the page before the 6th chapter, from the 5th chapter. Rambam Shmoneh Prakim. If a man sets this notion, says he. Now, here we'll just maybe briefly point to an aspect of Maimonides' thought that gives rise to all manner of controversy and maybe helps us out with our problem at a cost. So, Maimonides famously thought knowledge of God is the most important thing. Mitzvot, ultimately, in a very indirect and convoluted way, are the best way of, or give us the best opportunity of, achieving this knowledge of God, right? We don't worry too much or don't get too caught up in that as being the end point. But that just explains his starting. If man sets this notion, that is knowledge of God, as his goal, he will discontinue many of his actions and greatly diminish his conversation. For someone who adheres to this goal will not be moved to decorate walls with gold or put a gold border on his garment unless he intends thereby to give delight to his soul. If knowledge of God is the most important thing, then hopefully you would not be too concerned with whether I'm wearing designer footwear, right? This is just a classic old material versus spiritual type of evaluation, where religion is more concerned with the spiritual, and for Maimonides, to the nth degree, that is the case. So, a person who really values knowledge of God will be less concerned with certain types of act. Maimonides believes that the mitzvot are a way of encouraging us in that direction. They deal in the best possible way with human appetite and desire, such as to redirect our desires in the direction of knowing God and not this worldly stuff. Skip down to the next paragraph. Know that this level is very lofty, is difficult to reach. Only a few perceive it, and then only after very great discipline. So if a man happens to exist in this condition, I would not say he's inferior to the prophets. I refer to a man directs all the powers of his soul solely toward God may be exalted, who does not perform an important or trivial action, nor utter a word unless that action or that word leads to virtue, or to something leading to virtue, and who reflects and deliberates upon every action and motion, sees whether it leads to that goal or not, and then does it. This is what the exalted requires that we make as our purpose when he says, you shall love the Lord your God, right, with everything. He means set the same goal for all the parts of your soul, namely to love the Lord your God. So, this idea, love the Lord your God, set God always before you, to do that perfectly is very, very difficult. To really, really not care about any of our material pleasures and delights, to really absolutely marginalize them such that they impinge on your consciousness not at all, is a level of profit. It's almost impossible. But Torah mitzvot, best way of trying to encourage that. But look what he now says about this person who does achieve it. He means, as in, what does it mean? Set the same goal for all the parts of your soul, namely to love the Lord your God. The prophets, peace be upon them, have also urged this purpose. He, Solomon, said, in all your ways know him. The sages explained this and said, even with a transgression. That is, You should make your goal the truth when doing such a thing, even if from a certain point of view you commit a transgression. The sages, peace be upon them, summarize this whole notion in the briefest possible words and encompass the meaning with utmost perfection. So if you were to consider the brevity of these words, etc., then you would know it was undoubtedly spoken by divine power. What does he mean about transgression? It appears as if, and this is an interpretation given by many people reading it, and it does seem to be the most natural interpretation. We're supposed to do what is true because it is true. We aren't meant to blindly do things because God commanded them. He's told us that already. But that has serious ramifications. Because what it means is if I can work out that actually in this situation, the right thing to do is to apparently transgress a mitzvah, that's what I should do. That's what this is saying. Even with a transgression, meaning what? Even what might appear from a certain point of view to be a transgression. Rambam, a notorious elitist, intellectual elitist. At this point, though, only talking about prophets or, almost prophets and whether any of those exist. This is maybe just more kind of a rhetorical attempt to impress upon us how important it is to always be focused on God and truth and not on this world. So whether this is practical advice, I will leave that open. But he does seem to be saying that the person who really knows his stuff knows that they do what they do because it's true, not because God commanded it. And that means that if in a situation, this unique individual, this is not advice for the masses, but this unique individual recognizes that actually the right thing to do right now is not the mitzvah. It's what would appear in the eyes of the masses a transgression. That's the right thing to do. That's the right thing to do. That's what he seems to be saying. And therefore, the ramifications of eclipsing God's command and saying we do what is true because it is true would be that on occasion, should I maybe do things that aren't what God commands? You see, if God was there at the time commanding you, he'd tell you himself, no, I know usually you should do this, but right now it's the wrong thing to do. Only the prophet or the near prophet can do it. And Rambam's very, very careful, if you skip to the final page, to circumscribe this even in his philosophical writing. So even when he's talking to those who are maybe closer to this intellectual elite of whom he speaks, look at what he says in the guide 334. The law was not given with a view to things that are rare. For in everything that it wishes to bring about, it's directed only toward the things that occur in the majority of cases and pays no attention to what happens rarely. In view of this consideration, it also will not be possible the laws be dependent on changes in the circumstances of the individuals and of the times, as is the case with regard to medical treatment, which is particularized for every individual. On the contrary, governance of the law ought to be absolute and universal, including everyone, even if it is suitable only for certain individuals and not suitable for others. Now, there is a whole and very extensive literature on the extent to which we always take him at his word, the Rambam, in the guide. But I'm going to, right? And anybody who's aware of all the other stuff will maybe read this differently. But what he appears to be saying here is he kind of recognizes he's opened up a can of worms here by saying it's about truth. God commands things, and what God commands is truth. And therefore, you shouldn't just be doing it because God said so. Or, maybe to translate, what God said so is always truth. So doing it because it's true and doing it because God says so kind of amounts to the same thing. But that does mean that occasionally there will be situations in which you should transgress, and that will be the right thing. Having opened that up as a theoretical possibility, he's then very keen to say, but that doesn't, right? I'm aware of that, he's more or less saying here. I'm aware that mitzvot are, for the most part, so, good Aristotelian ethics. All moral principles apply for the most part. there's always going to be an exception. Rambam knows that. He thinks it's even true about mitzvot. However, and here's probably one of the killer points that maybe starts to bring religion and ethics back together again. Who's going to work that out? I've got to work out now whether or not a particular act is going to yield the ultimate end. How on earth would I do that? I would have to know what will transpire all the way from here to the end of my life, what everybody else is going to do that might affect what I'm going to do or might result from what I'm going to do. I would have to have infinite detail to actually be able to work out what act is going to lead to the ultimate end. And I can't do that. Nobody can do that unless they're literally like 4 individuals that Rambam at the end of the guide just says, well, these are the Avot, Moshe, they're special, they were different, nobody else is like that, like prophets, as he's just said. So maybe what's going on here is, it is the case that we should do what is right because it is right, and God wants us to do what is right. Working out what is right, however, is very difficult. So even though in principle, what this would mean is mitzvot are not absolute. They are usually the right thing to do in the vast majority of cases. Occasionally they might not be. But for me to actually know that and work that out is almost impossible. The only being that could work out the best system of law that will usually be right is God, so he gave us it. He gave us the instruction manual, we follow it. The genius philosophers, the Rambams of this world, understand that actually this means on occasion you might need to lose the battle to win the war. I might have to do what is objectively the wrong thing by observing a mitzvah. But on the whole, because I can't really work it out, because it's impossible for human beings to work it out, that's just what I'll do. 34. Observe the law. The law is indeed the truth. God does give us the truth. We do it because it's the truth and because God gave it to us, and we will come back to that in one moment. That opens up this can of worms, which is, well, what if what God said doesn't seem to be the truth? Rambam can say, yeah, that can happen. But actually, for the sake of the community, this is the philosophy of law bit, so to speak, right? When we should obey the law, even if in a particular situation we might think it is the specifically wrong thing, we keep it anyway, because we've kind of abdicated that to God. God tells us on the whole what to do. Obviously, he knows it doesn't always apply. That's why we have Torah Shabbat Pet, right? So we're always having to apply it and work it out. That's what we've been doing ever since the beginning of time. Yeah? But to literally do something that is a transgression, even that might be right on occasion. Even that. Whether we should take that opportunity and do it will depend on whether we're a prophet and how much we need to actually obey it regardless. But it does open up a can of worms that obviously Leibovitz's approach doesn't really. But just finally, to rein it back in, to bring it back to our opening question, I think that the answer to this question sort of redounds to a question of how optimistic or pessimistic we are about human nature. By which I mean the following. The reason that Leibovitz thinks that we must serve God and do mitzvot, and this is the ultimate, and not morality, is for the following reason. Have a look, question of human nature, number 4, Leibovitz. It says the following. Willing acceptance of a way of life which does not derive from human nature implies the emancipation of man from the bondage of raw nature. Man activated by his own nature is in effect nothing but a robot activated by the forces of nature, just like the cattle grazing in the pasture, which are also free from Torah mitzvot, that is, from any law externally imposed. Emancipation from the bondage of nature can only be brought about by the religion of the mitzvot. It cannot be accomplished by overcoming one's inclinations by rational or secular ethical considerations. What's he saying there? He seems to be arguing the following. religion, mitzvot, do transcend man. In transcending man, part of the ultimate value, right? We're serving the ultimate value, which is God, which transcends humanity. Morality and ethics, says he, that's just human beings following their nature. Just like cattle grazing in a field. That's just us doing the things that human beings do. As in, he does seem to think, have a very optimistic view, ultimately, of human nature. Humans are naturally given to seek out peace, harmony, society, nature. Right? That's our nature, to be ethical. Therefore, when I'm being ethical, I'm serving man. The only way to escape being bound to our own humanity is to do things that are completely humanly incomprehensible, or do things because God said so. That's serving God. Anything else is serving me. Fine. What if he's wrong? What if it's not the case that you can give a purely naturalistic account of ethics? That actually human beings would never come up with this ethics stuff were it not for some kind of higher value that we will call God, right? What if ethics isn't part of human nature? If ethics is human nature, mitzvot transcends it, serving God is doing mitzvot. But what if ethics itself reflects something that transcends human rationality? What if being ethical, whether you, and this is not, by the way, to say it's impossible to be a secular or a kind of a humanist about ethics. Of course you can. You don't have to believe in God to be ethical. But maybe, ultimately, whether you like it or not, you can't really justify an absolute fidelity to ethics based purely on human values. Because why would you give up your life for an ethical principle if it didn't serve your interest in any way whatsoever, unless you believed it was serving something that mattered more than you or human value? Why would you? Right? Not to say, as I say, not to say that everybody recognizes this, but if you think it down to its foundations, why would you willingly submit to this set of values that are just ultimately human convention, whatever they are, they serve things nicely, but all right, that's great, and on the whole it works. But would I give my life up for that? I might if it's divine, if it transcends humanity, and that is a view that you find in Rav Soloveitchik or Emmanuel Levinas, right? That being ethical itself is ultimately service of God. Not necessarily intended as such or known to be as such, but if you're doing it, you are subconsciously somewhere responding to higher values. Have a look at the final couple of quotes. Rav Soloveitchik. Man suddenly experienced the ethical imperative, which was prompted by autonomous, unique interests unknown to natural man. Revelation from God reveals things unknown to natural man. Leibniz said ethics is natural man, and that's why service of God can't be ethical. It's serving man. But if ethics isn't natural to man, then being ethical itself is serving God, whether you like it or not. That's Soloveitchik and Levinas down the bottom. Ethics is not the corollary of the vision of God, it is that very vision. Ethics is an optic such that everything I know of God and everything I can hear of his word and reasonably say to him must find an ethical expression. Point being that we started off with this question, is it wrong to be ethical? And the reason it would be wrong to be ethical would be if there was this thing, and it's called ethics, and it is completely and utterly a human convention created by humans serving human values, and religion is to do with serving God and serving divine values. And therefore, if I want to be a religious person, I have to do the latter, not the former. I shouldn't be being ethical. I have to be religious, Bittul Torah, etc. But that seems to be based on Leibovitz thinking that ethics is something that does express human nature. It's natural in some way. What if it's not? Soloveitchik, Levinas, who seem to think actually being ethical itself is something that transcends rational human speculation. that transcends natural values and that itself reflects something transcendent. If that's the case, then far from there being a contradiction between being ethical and religious, as soon as you're being ethical, you're being religious. You're doing something that reflects a transcendent value, a God, the divine, just by being ethical. And therefore, this dichotomy, it's not wrong to be ethical. Every time anybody's being ethical, there is a sense in which they're being an Eved Hashem. And in that case, thankfully, it's not wrong to be ethical. And you should all behave yourselves. Okay, so thank you very much for bearing with me for a couple of hours, and enjoy the rest of the day.